She slept in the church pew until the deacon locked the doors. The rancher unlocked his. The church was the First Methodist Church of Anselm, Oregon, and the pew was the last one on the left side, the pew nearest the back wall and farthest from the pulpit. The pew that nobody sat in on Sundays because the angle was wrong for seeing the minister, and the bench was harder than the other benches because it had been built from a different batch of lumber, and the lumber had been denser, and the density made the sitting uncomfortable, which is why nobody sat there on Sundays, which is why Verity Searle sat there every night. She had been sleeping in the church for 9 days, 9 days since the boarding house had turned her out, not with cruelty, but with the impersonal efficiency of a business that requires payment, and that had received no payment for 2 weeks. Because the laundry job that had been paying Verity's board had ended when the laundry's boiler cracked and the laundry closed, and the closing was permanent, because the boiler was cast iron, and cast iron does not crack partway. It cracks completely, and completely meant the laundry was finished, and Verity's income was finished, and the finishing of both happened on the same Tuesday afternoon in September. She was 23 years old. She had come to Anselm from Portland 6 months earlier because Portland was expensive, and Anselm was cheap, and the cheapness was supposed to be the bridge between having nothing and having something. But the bridge had collapsed when the boiler cracked, and the collapsing had left her on the wrong side of the gap with no way across. The church doors were unlocked. They were unlocked because the minister, Reverend Alsop, believed that a church should always be open, the way a hand should always be open, because an open hand gives and a closed hand withholds, and withholding from people in need is the opposite of the church's purpose, and the purpose of the church is shelter, not just spiritual shelter, but actual shelter. The roof and walls kind of shelter that keeps a person dry when it rains and warm when it is cold. And September in Oregon is the beginning of the rain and the beginning of the cold, and the beginning is the time when shelter matters most. Verity entered the church on the first night through the front door, because the front door was unlocked. She slept on the hard pew with her coat as a blanket and her bag as a pillow, and the sleeping was fitful, because the pew was hard and the church was cold, and the cold was not just temperature. The cold was circumstance, the cold of a woman who has run out of options and who is sleeping in a building that was built for prayer, because the building is the only building in Anselm that does not charge for admission. She left before dawn. She left before dawn every morning, because being found sleeping in the church would have been a humiliation, and humiliation was the one thing Verity Searle had left to lose. And the leaving before dawn was the protection, the preservation of the last shred of a dignity that was being worn thin by 9 days of sleeping on a hard pew in a cold church with a coat for a blanket. She spent the days looking for work. She went to the general store and the hotel and the feed store and the sawmill and the cannery down by the river, and the looking produced nothing, because the looking was being done by a woman, and women's work in Anselm in 1887 was limited to cooking, cleaning, laundry, and sewing, and the cooking positions were filled and the cleaning positions were filled and the laundry had closed, and Verity could not sew because sewing requires a machine, and a machine requires money, and money was the thing she did not have, and the not having was a circle that closed tighter every day. The deacon found her on the 10th night. The deacon's name was Horace Pine, and he was 61 years old, and he had been a deacon of the First Methodist Church of Anselm for 14 years, and he had the authority of a man who holds the keys, because holding the keys is a form of power, and power exercised by a 61-year-old deacon in a small Oregon town is a power that is small in scope, but absolute within its scope, the way a fence post is small but immovable. Horace Pine came to the church at 11 o'clock at night because he had forgotten his Bible on the lectern, and he came through the back door and he found Verity Searle asleep on the last pew on the left side, with her coat pulled over her and her bag under her head, and the finding was the end of the 9 days, because Horace Pine did not see a woman in need. Horace Pine saw a trespasser. "This is a church," Horace said. "This is not a boarding house." Verity sat up. She sat up with the speed of a person who has been found in a place she was not supposed to be found, the speed of shame, and the shame was on her face, and in her posture, and in the way she pulled her coat around her. the pulling an attempt to reassemble the dignity that had been stripped by the finding. The doors were unlocked, Verity said. The doors were unlocked for prayer. The doors were not unlocked for sleeping. Tomorrow I will lock the doors at sundown, and the doors will stay locked until Sunday morning. And the locking is necessary because the church is a house of God, and not a shelter for people who cannot pay their board. He left. He locked the front door behind him. The locking was the sound of the last option closing, the click of a bolt that said the building that had been shelter for 9 nights was no longer shelter, and the no longer was the finality, and the finality was complete. The lock turned with the sound of iron on iron, a sound that is small but final, the way a gavel is small but final. The sound echoed in the empty street. It echoed the way sounds echo in small towns at night, not off buildings but off the silence itself, the silence amplifying the sound because the silence has nothing else to carry. Verity had heard locks before. She had heard the boarding house lock when the owner changed the padlock on her door after 2 weeks of unpaid board. She had heard the laundry lock when the owner closed the business and locked the door with a chain and a padlock that was new and shiny and that gleamed in the afternoon light like a tooth in a grinning mouth. The locks were accumulating. The locks were the punctuation of her decline. Each lock a period at the end of a sentence, and the sentences were getting shorter, and the periods were getting louder, and the loudest period was the one Horace Pine had just placed on the church door. Verity stood outside the church in the dark. She stood on the steps, and she looked at the town, the dark windows, the closed doors, the particular silence of a town that is asleep, and that has no room for a woman who is awake, and who has no bed, and no money, and no options, and no direction except the road. And the road at night in September in Oregon is not a direction, it is a danger. The rancher was coming back from town. His name was Prosper Gaines, and he was 43 years old, and he had a ranch 7 miles south of Anselm, a cattle operation on 100 acres of cleared valley land, with a house and a barn and a bunkhouse that was empty because the summer hands had gone, and the winter was not yet severe enough to require additional help. He was coming back from the feed store where he had been settling an account, and the settling had taken longer than expected because the feed store owner liked to talk, and talking is the fuel that keeps small-town commerce running. He saw Verity on the church steps. He saw her the way a person sees something that does not belong. A woman on church steps at 11 o'clock at night does not belong, the way a fence post in a creek does not belong, and the not belonging is the signal that something has gone wrong. And something going wrong at 11 o'clock at night on church steps requires attention. He stopped his wagon. He stopped it the way he stopped for everything, without hurry, with the patient assessment of a man who works with cattle and who has learned that hurrying produces panic, and panic produces stampedes, and stampedes produce destruction, and the opposite of hurrying is steadiness, and steadiness was Prosper Gaines's defining quality. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I am not hurt. I am locked out." "Locked out of the church?" "The deacon found me sleeping in the pew. He locked the doors. I have been sleeping in the church for 9 days, because I have no other place to sleep. The deacon has decided that the church is not a place for sleeping. The deacon is correct about the purpose of the building. The deacon is incorrect about the purpose of a door, which is to open for people who need it to open." Prosper looked at the church. He looked at the locked doors, the doors that Reverend Alsop believed should always be open, and that Deacon Pine had closed. The closing a decision made by a man with keys, and without mercy, because mercy and keys are often held by different people, and the difference is the problem. "My name is Prosper Gaines," he said. "I have a ranch on the Valley Road. The house has rooms. The doors are not locked. I do not lock my doors because locking doors is a habit of people who believe that what they have is more important than what other people need, and I do not believe that. You are offering a room to a woman you found on church steps at 11 o'clock at night. I am offering a room to a person who needs a room. The church steps are the circumstance. The need is the fact. I respond to facts, not circumstances." Verity went with him. She went because the alternative was the road, and the road was dark and dangerous, and because the man with the wagon had not asked why she was on the steps, or how she had come to be sleeping in a church, or what had happened to the boarding house, or the laundry job. He had asked if she was hurt. And the asking if she was hurt was the question of a person who cares about the person, not the story. And caring about the person is the only kind of caring that matters at 11 o'clock at night on church steps. The ranch house was warm. The room was upstairs, with a bed and a quilt and a washstand and a window, and a door that she could close, and the closing was sufficient, because the closing was choice. She chose to close the door. She was not locked out of it. And the difference between closing a door by choice and being locked out of a door by a deacon is the difference between dignity and humiliation. And dignity was the thing Prosper Gaines had given her by giving her a door she could close. She woke in the morning to the sound of a rooster and the smell of coffee. The coffee was coming from downstairs. The coffee was being made by a man who had driven 7 miles from town at midnight, with a stranger on the seat beside him, and who was now, at 6 in the morning, making coffee as though the making of coffee for 2 people instead of 1 was the most natural thing in the world. And the naturalness was the kindness, because the greatest kindness is the kindness that does not draw attention to itself, the kindness that presents itself as ordinary. And coffee in the morning is ordinary, and ordinary was the thing Verity Searle needed more than anything. She came downstairs. The kitchen was warm. The stove was lit. The coffee was on the table. 2 cups, already poured. The steam rising in twin columns that caught the morning light from the window. Prosper was at the stove making eggs. He made eggs the way he did everything, without hurry, with the attention of a man who believes that even small tasks deserve care. And the care was visible in the eggs, which were cooked exactly right, neither too firm nor too soft, the precision of a man who lives alone, and who has learned to cook for himself, and who is now cooking for someone else, and who has not changed the quality of the cooking, because quality does not depend on quantity. They ate in a silence that was not awkward. The silence was the silence of 2 people who do not yet know each other well enough to talk, but who know each other well enough to eat in the same room without talking. And the eating without talking was the beginning of the knowing, because knowing a person begins with presence, not words. And presence was the thing they shared that morning, and the sharing was sufficient. She stayed. She stayed because the staying was offered without conditions, and the offering without conditions was so rare that it was almost unrecognizable. She cooked. She cleaned. She organized the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who has managed boarding house kitchens and laundry operations. And the organizing was the giving, and the giving was the exchange. Not a transactional exchange, but a mutual exchange. The exchange of 2 people who have something the other person needs, and who give it freely, because freely is the only way that giving works. Prosper did not ask her to stay. Prosper did not ask her to leave. Prosper understood that the decision was hers, the way the door was hers, open or closed, stay or leave, the choice belonging to the person who needed to make it, and not to the person who had provided the room in which the choice was made. One evening in October, 3 weeks after the church steps, Verity was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a newspaper that Prosper had brought from town, and Prosper was mending a bridle by the stove, and the domestic arrangement of the scene, the table, the newspaper, the stove, the bridle, the 2 people in the same room doing separate things together, was the arrangement of a home. And the arrangement had happened without discussion, because discussion would have formalized it, and formalization was not necessary, because the arrangement was not formal. The arrangement was natural, the way 2 people who belong in the same room naturally occupy the same room without needing to be told that they belong there. The deacon locked the church doors because he thought a building is more important than a person, Verity said. You unlocked yours because you thought a person is more important than a building. A building is lumber and nails. A person is a person. The comparison is not difficult. The comparison should not be difficult. For Horace Pine, the comparison was difficult. Horace Pine is a man who holds keys. Holding keys makes a person believe they have the right to decide who enters and who does not. I do not hold keys. I hold doors open. The holding open is easier than the locking, and the easier thing is usually the kinder thing, and the kinder thing is usually the right thing. Verity thought about the 9 nights on the hard pew. She thought about the coat as blanket, and the bag as pillow, and the darkness and the cold, and the particular loneliness of sleeping in a building that was built for gathering, the loneliness of being one person in a room built for 100. And the loneliness had been sharp, and the sharpness had cut something in her that she was only now feeling, because the feeling had been postponed by the necessity of survival. And survival postpones everything that is not survival, and the things that are postponed, grief, fear, relief, gratitude, arrive later, when survival is no longer in question, and survival was no longer in question, and the things were arriving now, all at once, the way spring arrives in Oregon, not gradually but suddenly, everything blooming at the same time, the blooming almost violent in its abundance. Verity set down the newspaper. She looked at Prosper across the kitchen, across the stove and the bridle and the lamplight, and the 3 weeks of quiet accumulation that had built, without blueprint or plan, the structure of a life that contained 2 people instead of 1. And she understood that the room upstairs was not temporary. The room upstairs was permanent, and the permanence was not offered. The permanence was grown, the way a garden is grown, one day at a time, by the simple act of showing up and doing the work, and letting the showing up become the answer to the question she had not asked, which was, "Can I stay?" The answer was in the door that was never locked. The answer had been there since the first night. The answer was yes.